It was a chaotic return to Singapore for Formula One, as wet weather meant that both qualifying and the race were run in changeable conditions. And what an action-packed race it was, with Max Verstappen out of position on the grid. There's a lot to talk about, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Singapore Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. The championship rolls on. This race weekend was the first opportunity for Max Verstappen to secure the Drivers' Championship for 2022. It was always unlikely, with the scenario required being a Verstappen win while outscoring Leclerc by 22, Perez by 13 and Russell by 6. But, in the end, with Verstappen and Red Bull's qualifying error, which we'll look at later, followed by his anti-stall start and mistake when trying to overtake Lando Norris, it was always unlikely Verstappen would be able to come back to victory. Meanwhile, both Perez and Leclerc were the 2 drivers that were out at the front, which would make it even more difficult to outscore them. It's never good for the sport when the championship finishes early, but it has been thoroughly deserved and earned by Max Verstappen throughout this season, with the last few races in particular being dominant for the Dutch driver. This was always going to be a difficult race for Verstappen, considering the conditions and the errors, and in the end it was a mistake trying to overtake Norris for 4th position that dropped him down the order with a huge lockup. I think we can all agree that seeing the championship continue on to Japan is going to be great to see, especially with it being a legacy Honda power unit in the back of that Red Bull. If they take the title there, then it could be huge for that team. So for me, the fact that the championship fight is still going on to Japan deserves a green box for this weekend, as it keeps it interesting for Formula One as a whole, and especially for the fans. A Mercedes own goal. This weekend was deemed to be a track where Mercedes might be able to take advantage, and it was possibly their best opportunity for a race win this season. The Mercedes car has tended to be strong on slower speed circuits such as Hungary and Zandvoort in the past. The changeable conditions also created a real advantage for Lewis Hamilton, who's always very quick in the wet weather. As such, in qualifying, it looked like Hamilton would have a huge advantage, as on the first runs he was a couple of seconds faster than his rivals. In the end, Hamilton would miss out on the pole position by around 0.05 of a second, but he would have a good opportunity to race from 3rd on the grid, especially considering the Mercedes has tended to be stronger in the races than they've been in qualifying this year. George Russell did struggle though and failed to make it through to Q3, which is critical on this circuit given overtaking is so challenging, which is exactly what he learned in the race. Early on, Hamilton struggled with a lack of grip on his intermediate tyres, as he was making calls on the radio to say that they hadn't picked the right compound for the British driver. As a result, he dropped back behind Carlos Sainz, but clearly had stronger pace than the Spaniard throughout the early stages of the Grand Prix. Throughout one of the virtual safety cars, it looked like Hamilton was trying his best to hassle the Ferrari driver, and even looked like he could have overtaken the car during that neutralised period. But it seems like the intimidation techniques didn't work, as it was Hamilton that made an error and put his car into the barrier as he lost positions and was then forced to make another pit stop to replace his damaged front wing. It seemed like such a brilliant opportunity for Mercedes and Hamilton in particular to secure that all-important victory in 2022. But in the end, it was an own goal that meant Hamilton ended up 9th while George Russell ended up 14th, which I believe is the team's worst result of the season. Looking at the last 5 rounds of the season, it seems unlikely that the team would be able to take a win this year with the nature of the circuits to come. But anything can happen in Formula One. One thing we know for sure is the fact that it seems like it was an opportunity missed for Mercedes this weekend in Singapore, so it's a red box for the Mercedes team. Before we take a look at Sergio Perez's performance next, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to Behind the Drive. I'm aiming for 60,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so if you haven't already, please do consider subscribing. Sergio Perez takes a controlled victory. Sergio Perez got off the line well in Singapore as he overtook Leclerc off the line and took the lead of the Grand Prix. From that point onwards, it looked comfortable for Perez at the front as he was able to defend from Leclerc throughout the race and also built a gap with the top 2 drivers being significantly ahead of Carlos Sainz in 3rd. It wasn't an easy race for Perez though, with 3 safety car periods plus several other virtual safety car periods constantly interrupting the driver as he raced around the streets of Singapore. For all the drivers, this race is a taxing one, with the hot and humid conditions and the fact that it's a 2-hour race at best, even in the dry conditions, with the walls ever so close. So for Perez being out in the lead, I'm sure he will have been under more pressure than most, considering he had to handle the speeds behind the safety car and to control the restarts to make sure that he was the driver that would come out on top. And that's exactly what he did in one of his best races for Red Bull. Lots of reporters on the Sky coverage were saying it was his best result ever, but I still believe his win in the Racing Point in Bahrain was better when he went from last to first. The only slight blemish for Perez is the fact that he's under investigation for leaving too much space behind the safety car and not being within 10 car lengths behind. It's a shame that the infringement wasn't evaluated and investigated during the race, and presumably the driver will need to be interviewed to determine the penalty, if any. But even after Perez was told, he did a brilliant job to pull out a strong 7-second lead to protect from a potential 5-second penalty. Regardless of that penalty though, I still believe Perez is deserving of a green box for his performance in Singapore. A qualifying session to remember. It's not often that I spend time in these videos discussing the qualifying session, but the qualifying event in Singapore was one of the best of the year. A rain shower from earlier in the day meant that the track was damp by the beginning of Q1 and would potentially switch to slick tyres at some point during the session. But due to the humid conditions, it takes a long time for the water to fully clear from the track, and often the track dries in some places and not others, which makes for a fascinating scenario with lots of different options for the teams and drivers to maximise their lap times. Early on in both Q1 and Q2, it was all about who could get the best possible circuit conditions so the last runner would have the best possible chance. As a result, there were some casualties early on, with Esteban Ocon and Daniel Ricciardo dropping out in Q1, while their teammates both ended up in the Q3 shootout. In Q2, George Russell missed out on the chance to compete for pole by 0.06 of a second, and eventually took a new power unit and started in the pit lane. Then came the Q3 shootout, which came just at a time where the circuit became better for the slicks rather than inters. Early on, all the drivers had the soft tyres on apart from Yuki Tsunoda, who briefly topped the standings before the slicks came into their own. Following this, the drivers were all staying out on track, building more and more temperature in their tyres and finding the dry line to maximise their lap time. And crucially, the drivers wanted to stay out as opposed to coming in to get new rubber. Just like the other sessions, the drivers would likely be setting their fastest lap times on their final attempts, and this was the case with Leclerc posting his fastest time towards the end. Meanwhile, Max Verstappen, who was on a quick lap, was told to abort the attempt by the team to recharge the battery in the final sector and go for another quick lap attempt towards the end. The time that was aborted was probably going to be fast enough for provisional pole position, and once again Verstappen was running fast before his race engineer told him to box to ensure that he would have enough fuel left over to provide the FIA with a sample at the end. It was a rare mistake from the Red Bull team, as had they just let Verstappen complete that penultimate lap, he would have potentially been much higher up in the order. It was a really exciting session, and it was great to watch. It almost reminded me of the early 2000s qualifying system with a peculiar rule that meant that the drivers in Q3 would need to run their race fuel quantity, so it ended up with drivers running lap after lap to burn fuel and reduce weight. Overall though, it was certainly a great session and deserving of a green box. A massive opportunity seized for McLaren. For the last few races, the battle for fourth in the constructors' standings was getting away from McLaren, as Alpine had built an 18-point lead over their rivals. But with a poor qualifying for Ricciardo and Ocon, it looked like it was down to Norris and Alonso to fight for the points. On the grid, Norris would line up 6th and Alonso would be 5th, so there was an opportunity for these drivers to compete for a good haul of points under the lights at the Marina Bay circuit. Early on in the race, Norris got past Alonso and Ricciardo made strong progress as he got up the order. But the key moment for the race was when Alonso retired with an engine failure. This created a massive opportunity for McLaren, who needed a huge haul of points to close that gap to Alpine in the standings. As always, it was Lando Norris who was Mr. Reliable once again, as he held on to the best of the rest spot and defended from Max Verstappen. It wouldn't take long for Ocon to have an issue for himself, as he retired after 28 laps. And all of a sudden, McLaren looked to be in the best position to take the fight to Alpine this weekend. There was then a huge opportunity for McLaren with the Yuki Tsunoda's incident on lap 36. At this point, many drivers were making the decision to switch onto slicks, with drivers all around Norris and Ricciardo stopping and the two papaya cars not stopping. At the point of the incident, they were running 3rd and 5th, with a huge opportunity to score a massive haul of points. After the stops under the safety car, it was 4th and 6th for the team. A great outcome which was improved further after Max Verstappen went straight on into the runoff area in an attempt to overtake Lando Norris at the safety car restart. So it ended up being 4th and 5th for McLaren with a 22-point haul for the team, meaning they've actually overtaken Alpine for 4th in the standings. It was a huge race for the team and for both of the drivers, particularly Daniel Ricciardo, who I think we can all agree has proven he's still got it from this race in Singapore. So overall, it's clearly a green box for McLaren for what was a brilliant result, and it's great to see that they're back in it with their rivalry with Alpine. Honourable mentions. Aston Martin are definitely deserving of an honourable mention this week with a brilliant double points finish for Stroll and Vettel. Their result has taken themselves above both AlphaTauri and Haas in the standings to 7th position, so it was a great result for that team. It was an interesting return to Singapore with a bit of a race of attrition, and it will be fascinating to see how it turns out as Formula 1 returns to Japan next weekend when Verstappen has another and a better opportunity to win the championship.